we are going to travel toward a place that may never have existed, or perhaps existed only as a memory transformed by time, or perhaps was inspired by several real places whose stories eventually became one extraordinary legend. Somewhere beyond the familiar coastline of the ancient Mediterranean, according to one of history's most famous stories, there was once an island of extraordinary beauty and power. It was said to contain fertile plains, mountains, springs, forests, canals, temples, harbors, and enormous walls arranged in circles around a central city. Its people were wealthy, organized, technologically capable for their age, and powerful enough to challenge the ancient world. And then, according to the story, something happened. The island was overwhelmed by catastrophe and disappeared beneath the sea, leaving behind only a memory. For more than 2,000 years, people have wondered whether Atlantis was a real place, a forgotten civilization, a distorted memory of an ancient disaster, or simply a philosophical story created to teach a lesson about human ambition. Tonight, rather than rushing toward an answer, we are going to move slowly through the mystery itself. We will listen to the imagined sound of waves moving across a dark sea. We will travel through ancient landscapes. We will examine the world in which the Atlantis story first appeared. And we will consider the natural events that could have inspired such a powerful legend. There will be no need to decide immediately whether Atlantis was real. We can allow the question to remain open for a while, because sometimes the most peaceful historical mysteries are the ones that cannot be completely solved. So imagine the sea at night, almost completely dark, beneath a sky filled with stars. The surface rises and falls gently, and somewhere beneath that water are mountains, valleys, volcanic rocks, ancient sediments, and perhaps the remains of countless ships and settlements that disappeared long before anyone thought to search for them. The ocean is enormous, and human memory is small. Between the two lies the mystery of Atlantis. The story begins in Athens, not on an island in the middle of the ocean, but in the world of ancient Greek philosophy, where questions about human nature, politics, morality, and the structure of society were often explored through stories and imagined conversations. The philosopher Plato is the person most closely associated with Atlantis. He lived during the 4th century BCE, and in 2 of his dialogues, known as Timaeus and Critias, he described an ancient civilization located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a name generally associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. According to the story, Atlantis existed thousands of years before Plato's own time and was presented as a powerful island civilization that eventually came into conflict with Athens. Plato's account describes a remarkable island organized around a series of circular waterways and walls, with a central elevated area surrounded by rings of land and water. The city was connected to the sea by canals, and the surrounding countryside was divided into agricultural regions. There were mountains, plains, trees, animals, fields, and abundant water. The description is detailed enough to make the place feel almost tangible. Yet the more closely we examine the story, the more complicated it becomes. Plato does not present Atlantis as a simple travel diary. He presents it within philosophical dialogues, and the story serves a purpose. It allows him to explore questions about ideal societies, political corruption, power, wealth, ambition, and the difference between disciplined communities and societies that become consumed by their own success. This does not automatically prove that Atlantis was entirely fictional, because ancient stories can contain fragments of older traditions. But it does mean that we should be careful when treating every detail as a literal geographical description. The mystery begins precisely here, because we have a story that sounds geographical, but also functions philosophically, and separating those two purposes after more than 2,000 years is extremely difficult. Imagine ancient Athens at night, long before electric lights or modern streets, when the city would have been illuminated mainly by lamps and fires. The Acropolis rises above the surrounding landscape, and beyond it, the Mediterranean stretches into darkness. The sea is not simply a background to Greek civilization. It is one of its defining features. Islands are scattered across the Aegean. Ships connect distant ports, and sailors carry goods, stories, languages, and ideas from one coastline to another. Greek communities were deeply familiar with the sea, and they understood both its opportunities and its dangers. A calm Mediterranean could make travel relatively pleasant, while storms could suddenly transform the same water into something dangerous. Earthquakes were also familiar to communities living around the Aegean, because the region lies within a tectonically active part of the world. Volcanoes, earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis were not abstract scientific concepts to ancient people. They were experiences that could reshape coastlines and destroy settlements. This is important because when we later consider possible inspirations for Atlantis, we do not need to imagine a mysterious force completely unknown to the ancient world. The Mediterranean already contained real examples of islands changed by volcanic eruptions, cities damaged by earthquakes, and coastlines altered by waves and geological movement. A story about a powerful island destroyed by catastrophe would therefore have been understandable to an ancient Greek audience, even without being a literal report of a single event. One of the most famous real places associated with Atlantis is the island of Thera, now commonly known as Santorini. Today, Santorini is famous for its dramatic cliffs, white buildings, and beautiful views across the Aegean. But its geological history is far more dramatic than its modern appearance suggests. Thousands of years ago, the volcanic island experienced one of the largest known volcanic eruptions of the ancient world. The eruption occurred during the Bronze Age, although the precise date has been debated and refined through archaeological and geological research. The explosion was enormous, and the volcanic center collapsed, creating much of the caldera landscape associated with Santorini today. Ash and pumice were distributed across surrounding areas, and the eruption generated disturbances in the sea. Tsunamis may have affected nearby coastlines, and the eruption disrupted communities across the wider Aegean region. The ancient settlement at Akrotiri, located on Santorini, was buried beneath volcanic material and preserved in remarkable condition. Buildings, streets, pottery, storage areas, and other archaeological remains survived beneath the ash because the settlement was covered before later human activity could destroy it. There is no evidence that Akrotiri itself was Atlantis, and the details of Plato's story do not match the archaeological evidence closely enough to identify the two confidently. Yet the similarities are fascinating. A prosperous island environment, advanced Bronze Age communities, monumental architecture, a powerful maritime culture, volcanic activity, and catastrophic environmental change all existed within the same broad region of the ancient Mediterranean. It is easy to understand why later generations have wondered whether memories of such events might have influenced stories about a lost island. Imagine approaching Santorini long before the modern villages existed, when the volcanic landscape looked very different from today. The sea would surround a rugged island dominated by volcanic terrain. The air might carry the smell of sulfur near active areas. The ground beneath the feet could be warm in places, and the distant horizon would be filled with the blue-gray waters of the Aegean. Somewhere on the island, a Bronze Age settlement would be alive with ordinary activity. Storage rooms would contain food and pottery. Buildings would rise several levels in some areas. Narrow streets would connect homes and workshops. People would move goods between the settlement and the coast. Ships would travel between islands and mainland ports. The community would be part of a wider maritime network. Then, imagine the first signs of geological disturbance. Perhaps the ground trembles. Perhaps animals become restless. Perhaps people notice changes in the environment that they do not understand. Ancient communities could recognize earthquakes, but they did not possess modern volcanic monitoring systems. They could not see deep beneath the island to understand what was happening inside the earth. If a major eruption began, the experience would have been overwhelming. Clouds of ash could darken the sky. Explosive sounds could travel enormous distances. Pumice could fall across the landscape. The sea could become disturbed. The horizon could disappear beneath smoke and ash. For anyone living through such an event, the memory could become deeply embedded in community traditions, even if later generations changed the details. Yet Atlantis is not simply a story about a volcanic eruption. Plato describes a civilization of unusual size and organization, and he places its destruction within a much broader narrative about moral decline and conflict. The Atlanteans are initially presented as powerful and prosperous, but over time, their character changes. Their wealth and power become associated with ambition, and eventually they challenge Athens. In Plato's account, Athens represents a disciplined society that resists corruption, while Atlantis becomes increasingly consumed by power and material wealth. The story, therefore, has a philosophical structure. The destruction of Atlantis is not merely a natural disaster. It is connected to a moral lesson about what happens when a powerful society loses restraint. This is one reason historians generally hesitate to treat Plato's account as a straightforward historical document. The story behaves like a philosophical narrative. It has a clear contrast between societies, a dramatic rise and fall, and a symbolic catastrophe. It may still contain echoes of real traditions, but the story has clearly been shaped to communicate ideas. Now imagine the ancient Mediterranean from above, although no ancient traveler could have seen it in this way. Thousands of islands, peninsulas, bays, mountains, and narrow seas create a complicated landscape. Communities are separated by water, but connected by ships. The sea is both barrier and highway. A sailor can leave one island in the morning and reach another by afternoon if the weather is favorable. A storm can interrupt the same journey completely. Trade routes stretch across the region. Copper, tin, pottery, grain, olive oil, wine, timber, textiles, and other goods move between communities. Cultures interact continuously. Stories travel with merchants and sailors. A catastrophe in one region can become a story in another. This is how memories can transform over generations. A real earthquake might become a city swallowed by the sea. A volcanic eruption might become an island destroyed by divine anger. A tsunami might become a great flood. A prosperous civilization might become an empire in later retellings. Centuries later, a philosopher could combine these elements into a story designed for an entirely different purpose. The result would no longer be a simple memory of the original event. It would become a new story built from old materials. The ocean itself encourages this transformation because it hides what it takes. When a settlement is destroyed on land, ruins may remain visible. Walls collapse, stones become buried, and broken pottery appears in the soil. Archaeologists can sometimes reconstruct the past from these remains. But when a coastal settlement is swallowed by the sea, the evidence becomes harder to see. Sediment covers structures. Currents move objects. Saltwater damages organic materials. Later geological changes can bury or scatter the remains. If an island were to partially collapse into the ocean, enormous sections could disappear beneath the water, leaving little visible evidence from the surface. This does not mean that every legend of a sunken city reflects a real submerged civilization. It simply means that the ocean provides a powerful environment for mystery. The sea can preserve some things while destroying others. It can move artifacts away from their original locations. It can bury ruins beneath layers of sediment. And from the surface, an entire landscape can vanish from view. Imagine descending slowly into the ocean at night, far from any modern coastline. Above you, the surface becomes a distant, shimmering boundary. Below, the water becomes darker and darker. Eventually, sunlight disappears almost completely. The temperature changes. The pressure increases. The world becomes silent except for the subtle movement of water. Now imagine an ancient stone structure resting on the seabed. It is not Atlantis necessarily. It could be the remains of an ordinary harbor, a collapsed coastal settlement, a natural formation mistaken for architecture, or something created by geological processes. From a distance, its shape might appear mysterious. A rectangular block lies beside another. A straight line extends across the sand. A circular formation rises from the seabed. Coral grows over the surface. Sediment covers half the structure. Without context, the human mind naturally searches for patterns. We are very good at seeing shapes and connections, even when they are produced by natural processes. This is one of the reasons underwater claims about Atlantis must be examined carefully. A strange rock formation can look like a wall. A natural fracture can look like a road. A cluster of stones can appear deliberately arranged. The mystery is real, but the interpretation may not be. One of the most important clues in the Atlantis story is the location Plato gives. He says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which are generally identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. In the ancient Greek geographical imagination, this placed Atlantis beyond the familiar Mediterranean world, somewhere in or beyond the Atlantic Ocean. This detail has inspired countless theories. Some have placed Atlantis near Spain, others near the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, the Atlantic coast of Africa, Antarctica, or even beneath the polar ice. Many of these ideas are imaginative, but lack convincing archaeological or geological evidence. The difficulty is not simply finding a place that resembles part of Plato's description. It is finding a place that matches the entire description, including the geography, chronology, scale, culture, and destruction. Once all these conditions are considered together, the number of plausible locations becomes extremely small. This is why mainstream historians generally treat Atlantis as a philosophical story rather than a lost civilization waiting to be discovered. But that conclusion does not make the story less interesting. In some ways, it makes the mystery more fascinating because we can ask a different question. Instead of asking, "Where is Atlantis?" we can ask, "Why did Plato tell the story, and what real experiences might have influenced it?" The ancient Greeks were deeply interested in stories about the distant past. Their world was filled with myths, genealogies, heroic traditions, divine stories, and accounts of ancient wars. Some stories may have preserved fragments of genuine historical memory, while others were clearly shaped by imagination and cultural tradition. The boundary between history and legend was not always as sharply defined as it is today. A story could be meaningful even if it was not literally true. A tale about a lost city could teach something about human behavior. A story about an ancient war could explain relationships between communities. A myth could preserve a cultural memory of a natural disaster without providing a scientifically accurate description of what happened. In this environment, Atlantis fits comfortably as a story that can be both fictional and historically interesting. It may tell us little about an actual island empire, but it can tell us a great deal about how ancient thinkers understood power, civilization, disaster, and the relationship between human ambition and the natural world. The most haunting part of the Atlantis story is not necessarily the civilization itself, but the idea of disappearance. Imagine a coastline at sunset. A settlement stands beside the water. Stone buildings catch the final sunlight. Boats rest near a harbor. Roads lead inland toward fields and hills. Everything appears permanent. Generations have lived there. Walls have been repaired. Houses have been rebuilt. Paths have become familiar. Children have grown up knowing every corner of the settlement. Then, imagine the same place centuries later. The buildings are gone. The roads are covered by sediment. The harbor has disappeared beneath the sea. The coastline has changed. No one remembers the exact location. Perhaps only a fragment of a story remains, passed from one generation to another. This is how lost places enter human imagination. A real place may disappear physically while surviving culturally as a memory. Over time, the memory changes because each generation tells the story differently. Eventually, the original event may become almost impossible to separate from the later imagination. There are many real examples of ancient settlements affected by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and changes in sea level. The Mediterranean region contains numerous archaeological sites that were abandoned, buried, damaged, or altered by natural disasters. Some coastal settlements now lie partially underwater because sea levels changed or land subsided. Others were destroyed by earthquakes and rebuilt repeatedly. Some were covered by volcanic ash and preserved. These real examples demonstrate that ancient people were not strangers to catastrophic environmental change. A community could disappear surprisingly quickly. A harbor could become unusable. A coastline could shift. Buildings could collapse. Fields could be covered by ash or sediment. A disaster that lasted only hours could reshape the history of a region for centuries. This makes it possible to imagine how stories of destroyed places might emerge naturally from ancient experience without requiring a single lost super-civilization. The sea is especially powerful in this respect because it creates a sense of finality. When land disappears beneath water, it seems to have crossed a boundary between the known and unknown. The ruins are still physically present, but they are hidden from ordinary sight. The waves cover them. The surface becomes a boundary between the present world and a world that can no longer be easily reached. This is why stories of sunken cities appear in many cultures, not just in connection with Atlantis. Human beings have long imagined drowned kingdoms, submerged temples, lost islands, and cities swallowed by the sea. Sometimes these stories may reflect actual coastal changes. Sometimes they are moral tales. Sometimes they are expressions of fear about the power of nature. And sometimes they simply arise because the ocean is one of the largest unexplored environments on Earth. Tonight, as we continue deeper into the mystery, we can let the imagined Atlantis remain beneath that dark water. We do not need to bring it to the surface too quickly. Picture an enormous ancient landscape beneath the waves, not necessarily as a literal reconstruction of Plato's city, but as a dream formed from everything we know about ancient civilizations and the sea. Imagine broad stone terraces descending toward a harbor. Imagine circular waterways reflecting the sky. Imagine fields and mountains beyond the city. Imagine ships moving slowly across a calm sea. Then imagine the centuries passing. The buildings become ruins. The roads disappear beneath vegetation and sediment. The coastline changes. Waves reshape the shore. Eventually, the sea covers parts of the landscape. Coral grows across the stones. Sand fills the courtyards. The once visible world becomes a hidden one. No dramatic moment is necessary. Time itself can accomplish what catastrophe begins. And this is perhaps the most realistic way to imagine a lost civilization. Not as a perfect city suddenly disappearing in a single instant, but as a place changing slowly through earthquakes, storms, political collapse, economic decline, migration, erosion, and the gradual movement of coastlines. Civilizations rarely vanish completely overnight. People leave, buildings decay, roads become less important, new settlements grow elsewhere, fields become forests or deserts, ports become shallow, rivers change course, languages disappear. Eventually, the place may become difficult to recognize. What once seemed permanent becomes archaeological evidence. If a later catastrophe then covers part of the remains, the original history can become even harder to reconstruct. In this sense, the real mystery of Atlantis may not be whether an island literally sank beneath the ocean, but how easily human landscapes can disappear from memory when enough time passes. The night sea continues moving as we imagine this forgotten world. Waves rise and fall gently. Moonlight touches the surface. Beneath it, darkness conceals everything. The ocean does not reveal its secrets simply because we ask questions. It keeps them beneath layers of water, rock, sediment, and time. Perhaps somewhere beneath the Atlantic are ruins that have never been identified. Perhaps there are ancient settlements still waiting to be discovered. Perhaps the strange shapes seen on the seabed are entirely natural. Perhaps Atlantis never existed outside Plato's imagination. All of these possibilities can exist within the mystery without needing to be forced into a single answer. The value of the story lies partly in that uncertainty. It invites us to look at the ancient world and realize how much remains unknown, even after centuries of scholarship and archaeology. For now, let the imagined city remain beneath the dark water. The circular walls are quiet. The ancient harbor is empty. Sand moves slowly across the stone roads. Coral covers the broken columns. Far above, waves continue rolling across the ocean's surface beneath the stars. There is no human voice beneath the water, only the movement of currents and the distant sound of the sea. Time has become almost impossible to measure. 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, all become part of the same darkness. The ruins do not know how long they have been there. They simply remain, slowly changing as the ocean moves around them. And somewhere above, on the surface, the night continues peacefully, carrying the mystery of Atlantis forward into another morning. The possibility that Atlantis was inspired by a real natural disaster becomes especially interesting when we look at the relationship between earthquakes and the sea. An earthquake beneath the ocean can disturb enormous quantities of water, and when the disturbance reaches a coastline, the resulting waves can travel far beyond the original point of movement. Today, we understand this through the science of plate tectonics and tsunami formation. But ancient people did not have those explanations. They experienced only the event itself. The ground could shake beneath their feet. The sea could suddenly withdraw or rise, and waves could arrive carrying debris from places that had seemed safe only moments earlier. A coastal community could be transformed in a very short period of time. Buildings might collapse. Roads could become blocked. Boats could be carried inland, and familiar landmarks could disappear beneath water or sediment. To people living through such an event, the boundary between natural disaster and supernatural catastrophe might have seemed very thin. The sea itself could appear to have risen against the land. If such an event were remembered for generations, the original details would inevitably change. A settlement damaged by a tsunami might later become a city swallowed by the sea. A coastal earthquake might become the anger of the gods. A wealthy island community might become a powerful kingdom. The actual event could become smaller or larger in the telling, depending on the needs of the storyteller. Over many generations, memory does not remain still. It behaves almost like water, moving around obstacles and changing shape, while still carrying something from its original source. The ancient Mediterranean was particularly suited to this kind of storytelling because it sits at the meeting point of several geological systems. The Aegean region contains active faults and volcanic areas, while the surrounding seas create opportunities for waves and coastal flooding to spread quickly. Islands rise from the seabed, some formed by volcanic activity, and others shaped by tectonic movement. The landscape itself is evidence of a restless planet. Mountains have been lifted by geological forces. Valleys have been carved over immense periods, and coastlines have changed as the land moved and sea levels shifted. To a modern observer, these processes are measured in geological time. But to an ancient community, a single earthquake could make the earth feel unstable and unpredictable. A stone wall that had stood for generations could collapse in moments. A harbor could become unusable. A road could split open. A hillside could move. Such experiences could leave deep cultural memories. Even if later generations no longer remembered the precise location or date of a disaster, they could remember that somewhere in the distant past, a great place had been destroyed by forces beyond human control. There is another intriguing feature of Plato's story that has encouraged generations of researchers to look toward real ancient disasters. The destruction of Atlantis is described as occurring in a remarkably compressed way, with the island being overwhelmed and disappearing from the world of the story. Plato describes earthquakes and flooding associated with the destruction. These details are difficult to reconcile perfectly with a literal geological scenario, especially when the entire island civilization is considered. But they do resemble the kinds of natural forces known to have affected real coastal societies. The important distinction is that similarity is not proof. A story can resemble a real event without being directly based upon it. Earthquakes and floods were common enough experiences in the ancient world that they could naturally become part of a fictional catastrophe. Plato may have chosen them because they provided an effective image of sudden destruction. A powerful society can build walls, temples, harbors, roads, and monuments, but it cannot command the earth beneath its feet. It cannot negotiate with the sea. In philosophical terms, that makes natural catastrophe an ideal instrument for demonstrating the limits of human power. The more we imagine Atlantis in this way, the less necessary it becomes to picture an impossible supercivilization possessing mysterious technology. The real ancient world was already remarkable enough. Bronze Age societies could construct enormous buildings, organize complex agricultural systems, sail across large stretches of sea, produce sophisticated metalwork, establish trade networks, and maintain communities over generations. They understood astronomy through observation, developed writing systems, created elaborate religious traditions, and built monumental architecture without modern machinery. Their achievements can seem mysterious only because so much knowledge has been lost or transformed. There is no need to add imaginary technologies to make the ancient world extraordinary. A prosperous Bronze Age island society connected to surrounding regions could have been impressive enough to inspire stories centuries later. If such a society suffered a major disaster, the memory could become even more powerful. The details of ordinary life would fade, while the catastrophe would remain. Imagine the island before anything went wrong. The sun rises over a calm sea, and the mountains catch the first light of morning. Springs provide fresh water, and streams descend toward fertile valleys. Fields stretch across broad plains, separated by low stone walls and irrigation channels. Groves of trees cover parts of the hills, while the coastline curves around sheltered bays. Stone buildings stand above the harbor, their surfaces bright beneath the sunlight. Boats rest in the water, their wooden hulls rising and falling gently with the waves. Warehouses contain grain, pottery, oil, tools, and other goods. The city is not necessarily fantastical. It is simply prosperous. People have developed systems that work. Roads connect settlements. Farmers produce enough food to support specialists and craftsmen. Ships carry goods between islands. Builders maintain walls and canals. Religious buildings occupy important locations. The city has existed long enough for its residents to believe that it will continue to exist. This is one of the quiet assumptions underlying every civilization. People build for the future because they expect there to be a future. They repair buildings because they believe their children will use them. They plant trees knowing they may not live to see them fully grown. They construct roads without knowing who will walk them generations later. Permanence is one of the great illusions of settled human life. Now imagine the first earthquake. It may not even be especially large. A few objects fall from shelves. Walls tremble. Water in storage vessels ripples. People step outside and look around. Then the movement stops. Life resumes. The city continues. Perhaps there are aftershocks during the following days. Perhaps cracks appear in buildings. Engineers and builders begin making repairs. The event becomes something people discuss and eventually remember as an unusual season. But beneath the surface, geological forces continue. If the island is volcanic, pressure may be building beneath it. If the earthquake occurred along an active fault, the movement may not be finished. Ancient people could recognize the signs of repeated earthquakes without understanding the underlying mechanism. They might know that certain regions shake more often than others. They might know which buildings are safer. They might know that the sea sometimes behaves strangely after strong earthquakes. Practical knowledge can exist without scientific theory. A community can become experienced at surviving dangers it does not fully understand. Then, perhaps, the disaster becomes larger. The earth moves again. The sound is deeper this time, not simply the shaking of walls, but the movement of the ground itself. Stone structures crack. Hillsides collapse. The harbor water begins moving in unusual ways. Far offshore, the sea may retreat or rise. The air fills with dust. The sky becomes difficult to see. Buildings that survived the first disturbance begin to fail. Roads are blocked. Bridges collapse. Water channels are damaged. The carefully organized landscape begins to lose its structure. A civilization depends on interconnected systems, and when several systems fail simultaneously, the effects multiply. If roads are blocked, food cannot move. If irrigation channels break, fields may dry or flood. If a harbor is damaged, ships cannot arrive. If storage buildings collapse, supplies are lost. If houses become unsafe, people move elsewhere. A disaster does not need to destroy every building to damage a civilization deeply. It only needs to disrupt enough of the systems that hold the community together. The sea would make such a catastrophe even more frightening. Coastal people live with the sea because it provides food, trade, transportation, and opportunity. But the same water can become destructive when driven by storms or geological movement. A harbor that normally protects ships can become a channel through which waves carry debris. Boats can break loose. Stone walls can be undermined. Sediment can be thrown across streets. The boundary between land and sea becomes uncertain. In a story told centuries later, this could easily become a civilization swallowed by the ocean. Yet the reality may have been more gradual. Parts of the settlement could have been destroyed by waves, while other areas remained. Some residents could have escaped inland. Others could have migrated to neighboring islands. Buildings could have been abandoned and slowly buried. The original city might have ceased to function long before every trace disappeared. This gradual disappearance is especially important because archaeologists often find evidence of abandonment rather than a single catastrophic ending. A settlement may contain signs that people left over time. Buildings may have been damaged and repaired repeatedly. Some rooms may contain objects left behind while others were emptied carefully. Food stores may have been abandoned. Roads may show changing patterns of use. Such evidence can reveal a complicated story rather than a single dramatic moment. Atlantis, however, has become famous precisely because its destruction is dramatic. The contrast between the philosophical story and the archaeological reality is therefore worth remembering. Real civilizations are messy. Their endings often involve many causes operating together. Wars, economic changes, environmental pressures, migration, political instability, natural disasters, and changing trade routes can all contribute. A single legendary catastrophe can simplify that complexity into one unforgettable event. There is also the question of time. Plato places Atlantis in an extremely remote past relative to his own era, describing it as existing thousands of years earlier. Whether this chronology was intended literally is another matter. Ancient systems of chronology were not always designed to satisfy the standards of modern historical dating. Numbers could carry symbolic meaning, and stories could use enormous spans of time to emphasize antiquity. If Plato wanted his audience to understand that Atlantis belonged to a distant age before familiar history, placing it thousands of years in the past achieved that effect. But this makes the story harder to compare with known archaeological cultures. If we try to identify Atlantis with a specific Bronze Age civilization, the dates become important. The Minoan civilization, the Cyclotic cultures, Mycenaean Greece, ancient Egypt, and other Bronze Age societies existed during periods that can be studied through archaeology and written records. Their histories do not match Plato's chronology perfectly. This does not completely rule out inspiration, because stories can shift dates dramatically, but it makes a direct identification much less certain. The Minoans provide another fascinating connection. The civilization centered on Crete developed large palace complexes. extensive trade networks, sophisticated art, and strong maritime connections during the Bronze Age. Sites such as Knossos reveal a society capable of impressive architecture and organization. The Minoan world interacted with other cultures throughout the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. The eruption of Thera occurred during roughly the same broad historical period, and the environmental effects of that eruption may have affected communities throughout the region. Again, there is no evidence that the Minoans were Atlantis, and the archaeological record does not support a simple equation between the two. But when we place Minoan Crete, Thera, and the wider Aegean world into the same picture, we see how an ancient storyteller could have encountered traditions about wealthy island societies, powerful maritime communities, natural disasters, and distant lands. Over centuries, those elements could be transformed. The idea of a civilization located beyond the pillars of Heracles introduces another possibility. Plato may have been using a distant geographical setting precisely because it was beyond the familiar Greek world. A place beyond Gibraltar was effectively at the edge of the known world for many Greek audiences. The Atlantic was enormous and mysterious compared with the relatively enclosed Mediterranean. Placing Atlantis there made the story feel ancient and remote. It also created a symbolic contrast between the known world and an imagined civilization beyond it. The farther away a place is, the easier it becomes to fill it with extraordinary qualities. Travelers return from distant lands with stories, and listeners naturally imagine landscapes they have never seen. Mountains become taller, rivers become wider, cities become richer, strange animals become more unusual. A distant island can become almost anything in the imagination. Atlantis may have benefited from this same process. Its location beyond the familiar world gave Plato enormous freedom to construct a society that could function as a philosophical opposite to Athens. The Atlantic itself has also contributed greatly to the modern fascination with Atlantis. Beneath its surface are vast underwater mountains, volcanic ridges, plateaus, trenches, and geological formations. The mid-Atlantic ridge runs through the ocean, marking a major boundary between tectonic plates. Volcanic islands rise from portions of this underwater landscape, including Iceland and several island groups in the Atlantic. The ocean floor is not flat or empty. It contains an enormous landscape hidden beneath thousands of meters of water. Modern mapping has revealed mountains larger than many land-based ranges, deep valleys, volcanic structures, and geological features that were completely unknown to ancient people. This does not mean that an Atlantis-sized continent recently sank beneath the Atlantic. Modern geology provides strong evidence against the idea that a large advanced continent once occupied the Atlantic and then suddenly disappeared beneath the waves. Continents do not simply vanish in the manner described by popular versions of the Atlantis legend, but smaller islands and coastal regions can certainly change, collapse, erode, or become submerged. The distinction between a lost continent and a lost island is crucial. Many Atlantis theories have been built around this misunderstanding. People hear that there are mountains beneath the Atlantic and conclude that they could be the remains of a sunken civilization. But underwater mountains are expected geological features. The ocean floor contains volcanic structures and ridges created by tectonic processes over millions of years. Finding an underwater plateau does not automatically indicate a former human settlement. Archaeology requires evidence of human activity. Tools, structures, ceramics, inscriptions, modified landscapes, or other material traces that cannot be explained naturally. Without such evidence, an unusual shape on the seabed remains a geological feature rather than a lost city. Modern technology has made it possible to map the ocean floor in extraordinary detail, but mapping has not produced convincing evidence of a vanished supercivilization corresponding to Plato's Atlantis. Still, the absence of evidence is not quite the same thing as proving that no small lost settlement ever existed. The ocean is vast, and archaeological exploration beneath deep water remains difficult. Coastal landscapes that were once dry land can now be submerged because sea levels changed after the last ice age. As glaciers melted, global sea levels rose, flooding many low-lying coastal regions. Human communities that lived near ancient shorelines could have been displaced or submerged. In some parts of the world, archaeological evidence has already demonstrated that prehistoric landscapes now lie beneath the sea. These submerged landscapes are real, and they remind us that the coastline of the ancient world was not identical to the coastline we see today. The sea has moved relative to the land. Some places that were once accessible by foot are now underwater. This provides a genuine scientific foundation for the broader idea of lost coastal worlds, even if it does not confirm Atlantis. Imagine one of these ancient coastal landscapes before sea levels rose. The shoreline lies farther out than it does today. Rivers flow across broad plains. Forests grow in areas that are now shallow seas. Animals move through valleys that will eventually disappear beneath the water. Human communities establish camps, villages, and settlements near rivers because fresh water and food are abundant. Generations pass. The climate changes. Ice sheets melt. The sea slowly advances. Unlike a tsunami, this process does not need to be dramatic. A coastline can move gradually over centuries. A place that was once inland becomes coastal. A coastal settlement becomes vulnerable to storms. Eventually, the sea reaches areas that were once dry. People move inland. The old landscape disappears beneath the water. Thousands of years later, the original shoreline may be almost impossible to recognize from the surface. If a later culture remembered that their ancestors once lived on land that was now underwater, the story could become part of a tradition about a lost homeland. This is one reason the concept of Atlantis remains so compelling even among people who do not believe Plato's island existed as described. The basic idea of lost landscapes is scientifically real. Human beings have always lived near water, and water has always changed. Rivers change course, lakes expand and shrink, glaciers advance and retreat, coastlines move, islands rise and erode, volcanoes create new land and destroy old land. Earthquakes lift some regions while lowering others. Over immense periods of time, the map of the world is never completely fixed. A civilization may build its entire existence around a particular coastline, only to discover that the coastline itself is temporary. This is not mythology. It is geology. And yet, despite all these natural explanations, the image of Atlantis continues to possess something that scientific explanations alone cannot remove. It is the image of a place that was once known and is now hidden. A city that believed itself secure. A civilization surrounded by water. A world of architecture, wealth, roads, gardens, canals, and temples that eventually became silent beneath the waves. There is something deeply human about this image because it reflects a fear that exists in every civilization. The fear that what we build will not last. Every city appears permanent while we live inside it. Roads seem permanent. Buildings seem permanent. Borders seem permanent. But history shows otherwise. Cities are abandoned. Rivers change. Empires collapse. Buildings become ruins. Landscapes transform. The Atlantis story turns this universal truth into a single dramatic image. Everything can disappear, even the greatest civilization imaginable. As the imagined night deepens, the underwater ruins become harder to see. The outlines of the ancient city fade into darkness. Only a few stone structures remain visible beneath the faint blue glow filtering down from the distant surface. Sand moves slowly across the floor of a forgotten plaza. Coral covers a broken column. An ancient road disappears beneath sediment. Somewhere in the darkness, a submerged cliff descends toward deeper water. Nothing moves quickly. There is no dramatic collapse now. The catastrophe is long finished. What remains is silence and time. The ocean does not know that people once called the place by a name. It does not know what political system existed there, what language was spoken, or what stories its inhabitants told their children. The water simply moves around the stones. The currents carry sediment from one place to another. Coral grows where conditions allow. Rock slowly changes. The city, whether real or imagined, has become part of the natural landscape. Perhaps this is the most peaceful way to approach the mystery of Atlantis. We do not need to force the ruins to speak. We can simply recognize that every ancient story is a small window into a world that has mostly disappeared. Plato's Atlantis may tell us about Greek philosophy. The eruption of Thera tells us about the power of volcanoes. Submerged archaeological sites tell us about changing coastlines. Ancient earthquakes tell us about the instability of the Mediterranean. Together, these pieces create a much richer story than the simple question, of whether Atlantis existed. They show us a world in which civilizations were always interacting with landscapes that could change without warning. They show us that memory can survive even when physical evidence disappears. And they remind us that the ocean still covers enormous parts of our planet that remain difficult to explore. The imagined city now lies completely beneath the darkness. Above it, the surface of the ocean is calm. Moonlight stretches across the waves, forming a silver path that breaks and reforms with every movement of the water. The wind moves softly across the surface. Far below, the ruins remain untouched by the light. If Atlantis was ever real, its inhabitants could never have imagined that their homes might one day become the subject of a story told thousands of years later. If Atlantis was fictional, Plato could never have imagined that his story would survive for more than 2 millennia and inspire explorers, archaeologists, writers, filmmakers, scientists, and dreamers. In either case, the story has achieved something remarkable. It has outlived the world that inspired it, whether that world existed physically or only within the imagination of a philosopher. And so, the mystery remains beneath the sea, not demanding an answer, but inviting curiosity. The ancient city rests in darkness, whether as archaeology, memory, metaphor, or myth. The ocean moves above it without revealing what lies below. The stars continue their slow passage across the sky. The night becomes quieter. The waves rise and fall. Somewhere far away, another coastline is being shaped by the same forces that have always shaped coastlines. Stone is being worn down. Sand is being moved. Rivers are carrying sediment toward the sea. Beneath the surface, geological processes continue at a pace so slow that human lives cannot easily perceive them. Time is still moving, just as it moved when ancient civilizations built their first walls. And in that immense scale of time, Atlantis becomes less a place we must locate, and more a reminder of how much of the human past has already been transformed, buried, forgotten, or carried away by the water. The darkness beneath the ocean becomes deeper as we move farther away from the familiar coastlines of the Mediterranean and allow the imagination to travel toward the open Atlantic. There is something almost hypnotic about the thought of an ocean stretching for thousands of kilometers without a visible end, its surface changing constantly beneath the wind, while its deeper world remains almost completely hidden. To ancient sailors, this vastness would have been difficult to comprehend in the same way that we understand it today. They could measure distances along familiar routes, recognize islands and coastlines, and use the stars to guide themselves. But beyond the familiar boundaries of their world lay an enormous uncertainty. The Atlantic was not an empty space. It contained currents, islands, storms, shoals, volcanic formations, marine life, and distant coastlines. But much of it was beyond the ordinary experience of Mediterranean societies. A story placing a lost civilization beyond the pillars of Heracles, therefore carried a special sense of distance. Atlantis was not merely far away. It existed beyond the boundary between the known and unknown. In the darkness of night, that distinction becomes even stronger. The horizon disappears. The sea becomes a single dark surface, extending in every direction. There is no visible road and no obvious destination. A traveler at sea must trust the stars, the wind, the currents, and accumulated knowledge. A civilization hidden somewhere beyond that horizon could easily become a symbol for everything that humanity does not know. The ancient Greeks were not the only people to live with this tension between the known world and the unknown. Every civilization has had geographical boundaries beyond which stories become increasingly uncertain. Mountains conceal valleys. Deserts conceal distant settlements. Forests conceal rivers and communities. Seas conceal islands and coastlines. When people cannot see a place directly, imagination begins filling the gaps. Reports from travelers become stories. Stories become traditions. Traditions become myths. Myths can later be interpreted as history. This process does not require anyone to intentionally invent a falsehood. A merchant may describe an enormous river after traveling for weeks. A sailor may return from an unfamiliar island and describe strange volcanic rocks. Another person retells the account years later. A storyteller adds detail to make the narrative more memorable. A philosopher uses the distant place as part of an argument. Eventually, someone reading the story thousands of years later may wonder whether every detail corresponds to a physical location. Atlantis is especially vulnerable to this process because Plato's description combines geography with philosophy. The island has mountains and plains, canals and harbors, but it also represents an idea about power. The more we try to separate the physical description from the philosophical meaning, the more complicated the mystery becomes. One detail that continues to capture the imagination is the circular organization of Atlantis. Plato describes rings of land and water surrounding a central area, with canals connecting the city to the sea. This arrangement has become one of the most recognizable images associated with Atlantis, appearing in countless illustrations and reconstructions. But circular settlements are not impossible in the real world. Ancient communities, sometimes built around natural topography, defensive walls, harbors, or planned geometric layouts. Circular or semicircular features can also emerge naturally through volcanic craters, erosion, or coastal formations. A ring-shaped harbor does not automatically point toward Atlantis. Yet the image remains powerful because it creates an architectural sense of order. The city seems carefully designed, almost as though its entire structure reflects the organization of the society itself. Water and land alternate in precise rings, connecting the central city to the surrounding countryside. The design suggests control over nature. Channels direct water. Walls define boundaries. Roads connect districts. Agriculture is organized around the city. Everything appears to have a place. That apparent perfection becomes important when the story later describes the civilization's decline. A society that believes it has mastered its environment eventually discovers that the earth and sea remain beyond human control. Imagine standing at the center of such a city before its destruction, looking outward across the circular waterways. The water is calm, reflecting the sky and the stone walls. Bridges cross the canals at regular intervals. Beyond the innermost ring, buildings rise across the next area of land. Farther out, additional waterways and walls create another circle, and beyond that the countryside spreads toward mountains. The entire landscape appears organized. There are fields, orchards, roads, and channels. The harbor lies farther away, connected to the city by waterways. Ships move slowly through the entrance. The city is prosperous because the surrounding systems work together. Water reaches the fields. Food reaches the markets. Goods arrive from the sea. Stone and timber are transported where needed. The architecture is maintained. The walls are repaired. The city appears stable. This is the kind of environment in which people begin to believe that stability is permanent. They may know that storms happen and earthquakes occur, but the larger structure of society seems too established to disappear. The very existence of monumental architecture reinforces that belief. Stone walls can stand for generations. Temples can outlive their builders. Roads continue to be used long after the people who first constructed them are gone. A civilization surrounded by such structures can begin to imagine itself as permanent. Yet nature does not recognize permanence. A volcano does not care how carefully a harbor was designed. An earthquake does not care how old a wall is. A tsunami does not care how prosperous the people living beside the water may be. The physical world operates according to processes that existed long before human civilization and will continue long after it. This is one of the reasons natural disasters became such powerful themes in ancient stories. They provided a way to express the limits of human control. A king may command an army, but he cannot command an earthquake. A wealthy city may build enormous seawalls, but it cannot completely control the ocean. A farmer may cultivate fertile land for generations, but a volcanic eruption can cover fields in ash. These realities would have been visible to ancient communities. They did not need modern science to understand that nature could destroy what humans built. They only needed memory. The possibility that Atlantis was influenced by a collection of different disasters is therefore worth considering. Perhaps there was no single event that inspired the story. Perhaps stories about earthquakes in one region, volcanic eruptions in another, floods somewhere else, and memories of powerful maritime civilizations were combined over time. Ancient storytelling often worked through accumulation. A narrative could gather details from different sources without preserving the original distinctions between them. A wealthy island civilization might have been inspired by Bronze Age Crete. A catastrophic destruction might have echoed the eruption of Thera. A distant location might have been chosen because the Atlantic represented the unknown. The moral framework could have come entirely from Plato's philosophical interests. When these elements are combined, the result is Atlantis. In that sense, searching for one exact physical island may miss the more interesting possibility that Atlantis was created from many pieces of the ancient world. The eruption of Thera deserves another quiet visit because its scale helps us understand why ancient disasters could become legendary. The volcano did not simply produce a small plume of smoke. It released enormous quantities of volcanic material into the atmosphere and transformed the island itself. The eruption created a landscape that would have been almost unimaginable to anyone witnessing it directly. Ash and pumice spread across surrounding areas while the volcanic center collapsed. The sea around the island would have been dramatically affected. Communities elsewhere in the Aegean could have experienced unusual weather, ashfall, earthquakes, or waves. The eruption became part of a wider period of environmental disturbance. We cannot know exactly how people interpreted the event, but it is easy to imagine that stories emerged. Ancient people did not need to understand the internal structure of a volcano to recognize that the earth itself had become dangerous. A mountain that had appeared stable could suddenly release fire, ash, and rock. The sea could behave differently. The sky could darken. Daylight could become strange. Such an experience would be remembered. Today, the remains of Akrotiri provide a remarkable glimpse into Bronze Age life because volcanic material preserved portions of the settlement. The ruins show buildings, streets, storage areas, pottery, and artistic remains. The site is valuable precisely because it gives us something that myths cannot provide: physical evidence. We can study the architecture. We can examine the materials. We can determine how rooms were used. We can date the remains. We can compare the settlement with other Bronze Age communities. Archaeology allows us to move from imagination toward evidence. And when we compare Akrotiri with Plato's Atlantis, we see both similarities and differences. Akrotiri demonstrates that complex island societies existed. It demonstrates that major volcanic disasters occurred. It demonstrates that entire settlements could become buried and preserved. But it does not demonstrate the existence of Atlantis. The distinction matters. A real example can make a legendary story more understandable without proving the legend itself. The same principle applies to other proposed locations. Over the centuries, people have suggested islands and coastlines across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, searching for landscapes that resemble Plato's description. Some theories point towards Spain and the Atlantic coast of Europe. Others focus on islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Some connect Atlantis with the Canary Islands or the Azores. Others have suggested locations much farther away. Each proposal usually begins with a particular similarity: a geological formation, a submerged plateau, a circular harbor, an ancient settlement, or a historical tradition. But the difficulty is that one similarity is not enough. If a proposed location has the right geography but the wrong date, the theory becomes weak. If it has the right date but no evidence of the described civilization, it becomes weak. If it has geological evidence of submergence but lies far from Plato's geographical description, the connection becomes even more difficult. A convincing historical identification requires multiple independent lines of evidence that fit together. This is why the search for Atlantis often tells us as much about modern imagination as it does about ancient history. Each generation tends to reinterpret the mystery according to its own interests. In earlier centuries, Atlantis was sometimes imagined as evidence of forgotten ancient wisdom. Later, it became connected with theories about lost continents and vanished civilizations. In the modern era, popular culture has transformed it into a world of advanced technology, glowing cities, enormous temples, and mysterious machines. These images are visually powerful, but they are far removed from what Plato actually wrote and from what archaeology can support. The fictional Atlantis has become almost independent of the original story. It now exists as a cultural idea of the lost civilization, even for people who have never read Plato. This is another example of how myths evolve. The original story is only the beginning. Each generation adds something new. The idea of an advanced civilization disappearing beneath the sea also resonates with modern concerns about climate change and rising sea levels. Today, coastal communities around the world are aware that sea levels can change and that low-lying regions can become vulnerable to flooding. Modern science gives us tools for measuring these changes, but the basic human experience is ancient. People have always depended upon coastlines while knowing that coastlines are unstable. The sea provides food and transportation, but it also threatens settlements during storms. In this sense, Atlantis feels surprisingly modern. A prosperous society living beside the ocean and assuming that its environment will remain stable is a familiar idea even today. The story becomes a reminder that civilizations are always shaped by geography and environmental conditions. A city cannot be separated completely from the landscape that supports it. There's also a quieter connection between Atlantis and the archaeology of submerged landscapes. During the last ice age, global sea levels were significantly lower than today because enormous amounts of water were stored in glaciers. As the climate warmed and ice sheets melted, sea levels rose. Coastal plains that had once been dry land were gradually flooded. Human communities that had lived along those ancient shorelines were forced to adapt or move. Some landscapes disappeared beneath shallow seas. Archaeologists have found evidence of prehistoric human activity in submerged environments in different parts of the world. These discoveries demonstrate that the coastline has never been fixed. A place that is underwater today may once have been dry land. A bay may once have been a valley. An island may once have been connected to a mainland. The sea has a long memory, but it does not preserve the human map. Imagine walking across such an ancient coastal plain thousands of years ago. There is no ocean where the modern map would place it. Instead, there are rivers, wetlands, grasslands, forests, and perhaps small human settlements. The climate is different. Animals that are now extinct or geographically displaced move through the landscape. People follow rivers and coastlines, collecting food, hunting, fishing, making tools, and establishing camps. Generations pass. Then the climate changes. The glaciers retreat. The sea rises. The coastline moves inland slowly. A familiar bay becomes deeper. Lowlands become wetlands and eventually shallow seas. People move toward higher ground. The old settlement is abandoned. Centuries later, the original landscape is underwater. If a story about an ancient homeland survives, later generations may remember it as a place lost to the sea. This is not Atlantis, but it demonstrates how a genuine lost world can form beneath the water without any supernatural explanation. The distinction between a submerged landscape and a sunken city is important. Geological processes can lower land locally, and sea level rise can flood coastal regions. But the idea of an entire large continent sinking suddenly beneath the Atlantic is incompatible with modern geology. Continents are supported by the structure of Earth's crust, and their movement occurs over enormous geological timescales. Large continental blocks do not simply drop beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic event. Islands, volcanic structures, and coastal areas can change much more dramatically, but a vast, advanced continent disappearing within a day is not a realistic geological scenario. This does not make Plato's story scientifically disappointing. It simply tells us that the story should not be treated as a literal geological report. Its power comes from the way it transforms natural and human realities into a memorable narrative. Perhaps the most intriguing question is whether Plato himself intended his readers to believe Atlantis was real. The dialogues provide clues, but scholars have debated the issue for centuries. Plato presents the story through characters rather than as a straightforward historical essay. The account is connected to discussions about the ideal state and the nature of political virtue. The ancient setting gives the story authority and distance. By placing the conflict thousands of years in the past, Plato creates a world in which Athens can be imagined as possessing a heroic antiquity. The story also allows him to contrast two societies. Atlantis becomes wealthy and powerful, but morally corrupted, while Athens is portrayed as disciplined and courageous. The destruction of Atlantis, therefore, functions as part of the philosophical argument. Whether Plato expected his audience to interpret every detail literally is difficult to establish with certainty, but the structure strongly suggests that philosophical purpose was central. This means that perhaps the greatest mistake in the Atlantis mystery is asking only, where was the island? A more useful question is, what was Plato trying to show by creating this island? The answer leads us toward ideas that are still relevant. Plato was interested in what happens when power grows faster than wisdom. He was interested in societies that become wealthy but lose restraint. He was interested in political organization, justice, ambition, and the relationship between individual character and the larger state. Atlantis provides a dramatic setting for those questions. The civilization is not destroyed simply because it is wealthy. Its downfall follows a process in which wealth and power are accompanied by moral decline. The island becomes a warning. The more powerful a society becomes, the greater the consequences when that power is used without wisdom. This philosophical interpretation also explains why the destruction of Atlantis is so complete. A moral story benefits from a dramatic ending. If Atlantis merely suffered a recession, changed its political system, and gradually declined, the lesson would be less powerful. But if the entire civilization disappears beneath the sea, the message becomes unforgettable. The greatest city can fall. The strongest walls cannot guarantee survival. Wealth cannot purchase immortality. Human achievements remain vulnerable to forces, both internal and external. The ocean becomes the final image of impermanence. Everything that seemed permanent is covered by water, leaving future generations to wonder whether the civilization ever existed. Now, imagine the fictional Atlantis at the moment before its final night. The city is quiet beneath a darkening sky. The circular waterways reflect the last light of sunset. The mountains beyond the city are silhouettes. The harbor is calm. The fields are still. There is no need to show crowds or dramatic scenes. We can simply observe the landscape. Stone walls rise around the waterways. Bridges cross the channels. Trees move gently in the wind. The sea beyond the harbor is darkening as evening arrives. Everything appears ordinary. Perhaps this is the most unsettling part of any lost world story. The disaster has not happened yet. The city does not know that its future will become a mystery. The people who built the roads do not know that one day the roads will be buried. The builders of the walls do not know that waves may eventually cover them. The landscape appears permanent because permanence is how the present always feels. Night arrives. Stars appear above the mountains. The water in the canals becomes black and reflective. The city is illuminated by small points of fire and lamplight. Beyond the walls, the ocean moves quietly. Far beneath the surface, geological forces continue their slow movement. The earth beneath the island is not still. It never is. Rocks are under pressure. Faults move. Magma may exist deep below volcanic regions. The planet is constantly changing, even when the surface appears calm. To human eyes, a quiet night can conceal enormous forces. This is true today just as it was thousands of years ago. We live on a dynamic planet, but experience it at the scale of individual days. Most geological processes are too slow to notice, while rare disasters compress enormous energy into moments that become unforgettable. The imagined first tremor passes through the city. The water in the canals ripples. A few stones fall from a wall. Then the ground becomes still again, Perhaps another tremor follows. The mountains remain dark against the sky. The sea begins to move differently. There is no need to make the scene violent. In a sleep documentary, the catastrophe can remain distant, almost dreamlike. We can imagine the slow realization that the landscape is changing. A crack appears across a stone terrace. A section of seawall shifts. Sand begins sliding from a hillside. Water enters a lower courtyard. The city that seemed so organized begins to experience small disruptions. The natural world is quietly reclaiming control. Hours pass. The sea rises. Waves move through damaged harbor structures. Sediment spreads across roads. Stone blocks collapse into the water. The circular canals fill with debris. A portion of the outer wall gives way. Water reaches places that had never experienced it before. The city is no longer functioning as a single system. Paths are blocked. Channels overflow. Buildings become unstable. The landscape that once seemed perfectly controlled has become unpredictable. The catastrophe does not need to be supernatural. It only needs to be larger than the city's ability to respond. And perhaps that is what makes the story so powerful. A civilization can be extraordinarily capable and still be vulnerable to events outside its control. Eventually, the night passes. The waves calm. The sky becomes lighter. But the city has changed. Some structures remain standing. Others are broken. Parts of the harbor are buried. The coastline has shifted. People have begun leaving the damaged areas. Some move inland. Others travel to neighboring islands. The city may continue for years in reduced form, but its former strength is gone. The story of Atlantis does not need to imagine every stage. It simply compresses the process into a single legendary disappearance. Centuries later, the ruins may be barely visible. Vegetation grows across abandoned structures. Earthquakes continue. Storms move sediment. The sea slowly advances. Eventually, only fragments remain. This gradual transformation may be more realistic than the dramatic image of an entire island suddenly falling beneath the waves. Civilizations can disappear without being physically destroyed completely. A city may lose its population. Its buildings may be reused by later communities. Its name may change. Its language may vanish. Roads may become fields. Temples may become quarries. Stone blocks may be carried away and used in newer buildings. Over generations, the original city becomes almost impossible to reconstruct. If the area is then flooded or buried, the evidence becomes even harder to interpret. In this way, the disappearance of a civilization is often a process rather than an event. Atlantis, as a legend, turns that long process into one unforgettable night. The imagined underwater ruins now lie beneath centuries of sediment. The circular harbor is barely visible. A broken stone wall disappears beneath sand. Coral has grown across the old foundations. The roads are no longer roads. They are geological surfaces covered by marine deposits. The city has become part of the seabed. The ocean moves gently above it, unaware of its former purpose. If a modern sonar scan passed over the area, strange shapes might appear. A circular formation might suggest a structure. A straight line might resemble a wall. But only careful investigation could determine whether the shapes were natural or artificial. This is why underwater archaeology is so important. The sea creates mystery easily, but evidence is harder to obtain. The human mind naturally wants the mystery to have a final answer. We want to discover the exact location, uncover the ruins, read the inscriptions, and finally say, "This was Atlantis." But perhaps history does not always offer such endings. Some questions remain uncertain because the evidence was destroyed long before anyone thought to preserve it. Other questions remain uncertain because the original story was never intended as literal history. Atlantis may belong to both categories at once. It may preserve distant echoes of real ancient experiences while being fundamentally shaped by philosophical imagination. There may never be a single archaeological site that explains the entire story. Instead, the mystery may be distributed across many real places and events. The night ocean remains calm as we leave the imagined ruins behind. Above the water, clouds move slowly across the stars. The surface reflects occasional patches of moonlight. Beneath the waves, the seabed stretches into darkness. There is something deeply peaceful about this hidden world. Nothing needs to be discovered tonight. The ruins can remain where they are. The questions can remain unanswered. Atlantis does not need to rise from the ocean for its story to have meaning. The mystery itself has already survived longer than most civilizations. Plato's words traveled through generations, languages, wars, empires, and changing ideas. The island became larger in imagination as the centuries passed. It became a symbol of everything lost, everything forgotten, and everything humanity fears it may someday lose. And perhaps that is why the story continues to return. Every civilization leaves behind structures that seem permanent, yet history teaches us that permanence is temporary. Every coastline appears stable, yet geology teaches us that coastlines move. Every generation believes it understands its world, yet the ocean reminds us how much remains hidden. Atlantis stands at the intersection of all three ideas. It is a lost civilization, a changing landscape, and an unanswered question. Whether it was invented by Plato, inspired by older memories, shaped by real disasters, or formed from a mixture of all these influences, it has become part of human history in its own right. The island may never be found, but the story has already become a kind of civilization that exists in memory rather than stone. As the first pale light of dawn begins to appear over the imagined Atlantic, the waves become slightly brighter. The night sky fades from black to deep blue. The horizon slowly returns. Somewhere beneath the water, the ruins remain invisible. The sea looks completely ordinary from above. There is no sign of the city, no monument breaking the surface, no ancient tower rising from the waves. Just water, wind, and distance. And perhaps that is exactly how a lost world should remain, not dramatically waiting to be discovered, but quietly absorbed into the landscape, its physical traces becoming part of the ocean, while its story continues to travel through human imagination. The wind passes over the waves and carries nothing away except a little moisture and sound. The sea continues toward the horizon. The ancient mystery remains beneath it, silent and patient, waiting not necessarily for someone to find it, but simply for someone to wonder whether it was ever there. As morning slowly brightens the ocean, the imagined journey begins to move away from the question of where Atlantis was and toward the larger world that surrounded the story. The sea remains calm, and the darkness beneath it gives way to a deep blue that becomes lighter as the sun rises. Somewhere below the surface, the ancient ruins remain hidden beneath sediment, whether they belong to a real settlement or only to the landscape of imagination. Above them, the ocean continues its ordinary movement, carrying water across enormous distances through currents that existed long before human civilization. The surface may look simple, but beneath it is a complicated world of ridges, trenches, volcanic mountains, continental shelves, canyons, and plains. The modern ocean floor is almost another planet, a landscape that humans cannot normally see without technology. This hidden geography helps explain why the Atlantis story continues to feel possible, even when its literal interpretation is difficult to support. The ocean contains real places that look extraordinary when revealed by sonar and underwater exploration. There are mountains taller than many famous land mountains, enormous volcanic formations, deep valleys, and ancient geological structures. Some areas contain the remains of human activity, while others only appear mysterious because their natural shapes are unfamiliar. The difference between an archaeological discovery and a geological curiosity can be enormous, but from a distance, both can inspire the same feeling of wonder. Perhaps this is one of the reasons the story has remained so powerful. Atlantis exists in the space between what we know and what we imagine might be waiting beyond the limits of our knowledge. If we return to the ancient Mediterranean, another possibility begins to emerge from the quiet background of the story: the importance of memory. Ancient societies did not have modern newspapers, digital archives, satellites, or recording devices that could preserve an event exactly as it happened. Much of what people knew about the distant past came through oral traditions, inscriptions, monuments, religious stories, genealogies, and written accounts, created long after the events themselves. A community might preserve the memory of a great flood, earthquake, war, migration, or destroyed settlement for generations. But memory is not a perfect recording. It changes as it is repeated. Details disappear. Other details become more important. A small settlement can become a great city in later storytelling. A local disaster can become a regional catastrophe. A historical leader can become a legendary figure. A real coastline can become an island in the story. This does not mean ancient people were simply inventing history. It means that memory was one of the tools through which they understood the past. If a powerful community had been destroyed by a major natural event, its descendants, or neighboring cultures, might have preserved a simplified version of that story for centuries. By the time Plato encountered such traditions, if he encountered them at all, the original event could have been almost impossible to recognize. Consider how a flood might be remembered. The original event could have been relatively local, perhaps affecting a river valley or coastal settlement. People escape to higher ground. Houses are damaged. Fields are covered with mud. Boats are lost. The community rebuilds. Years later, children hear the story from their parents. A generation later, the event becomes a story told at festivals or gatherings. The next generation remembers that the water once covered the land. Eventually, the location becomes less important than the catastrophe itself. The story may then be connected with moral lessons, divine punishment, heroic survival, or the origins of a community. If another flood happens in a different region, elements of the two stories may merge. Over centuries, multiple memories can become one narrative. This process is not unique to ancient cultures. Modern people also compress complicated events into simple stories, especially when they are retold repeatedly. The difference is that ancient traditions often traveled for much longer periods before being written down, giving them even more opportunity to change. This possibility makes the number of years between the supposed age of Atlantis and Plato especially interesting. If Plato intended the story to be set thousands of years before his time, there would have been an enormous gap between the supposed events and the dialogue in which they were described. Even if some older memory existed, preserving exact geographical details over such a period would be extremely difficult. Languages would change. Political boundaries would disappear. Place names would be forgotten. Landscapes themselves could change. Rivers could move. Coastlines could shift. Mountains would remain. But even familiar mountains might acquire different names and meanings. The farther back a story reaches, the more likely it becomes that history and symbolism will become intertwined. This does not make the story meaningless. It simply means that the Atlantis narrative should be approached differently from a modern archaeological report. The ancient world also understood history through cycles of rise and decline. Powerful kingdoms appeared, grew wealthy, became ambitious, and eventually weakened. Cities that had seemed unstoppable could be destroyed by war or disaster. Monuments that represented enormous power could become ruins within a few centuries. This pattern was visible across the Mediterranean and Near East. Ancient peoples did not need modern historians to understand that civilizations were temporary. They could look around and see older ruins, abandoned settlements, broken walls, and monuments belonging to rulers whose names had already become obscure. A story about Atlantis, therefore, fit naturally into a worldview where greatness could be followed by collapse. The island represented represented an extreme version of a familiar historical pattern. It became powerful, prosperous, and confident, and then it disappeared. The lesson was simple enough to survive across generations. No society should assume that its wealth and strength make it immune to decline. There's also something fascinating about the way Plato's Atlantis is connected to Athens. Instead of simply describing a lost island, Plato places the ancient Athenians in conflict with Atlantis. This gives the story a political dimension. Athens becomes the smaller society that resists the larger and wealthier power. The contrast allows Plato to discuss what makes a society strong. Is strength measured by wealth, territory, military power, or something else? Can a society remain just when it becomes extremely prosperous? Does expansion make a civilization more secure, or does it create new vulnerabilities? These questions are hidden inside the story of the island. Atlantis may therefore be less about discovering a forgotten place and more about imagining what happens when a civilization becomes too confident in its own power. Its destruction becomes a warning about imbalance. This idea becomes especially interesting when we return to the image of the circular city. The rings of water and land suggest control, order, and engineering. Everything appears carefully arranged. Water flows where the builders want it to flow. Roads follow deliberate patterns. The central city dominates the surrounding landscape. The outer regions provide agriculture and resources. The harbor connects the civilization to the wider sea. It is a model of organized power. Yet this organization is also fragile. The same waterways that make the city prosperous can become channels for floodwater. The walls that protect the city can collapse during an earthquake. The harbor that connects it to trade can be destroyed by a tsunami. The irrigation system that supports agriculture can fail if the water channels are damaged. The very systems that create prosperity can become sources of vulnerability when the environment changes. This is a lesson that applies far beyond Atlantis. Every civilization builds systems to control its environment, but those systems always depend upon the environment remaining within certain limits. Imagine the city after many centuries of successful growth. The walls have been expanded, new buildings have been added, canals have been repaired and widened. Agricultural fields have moved farther into the surrounding plains. The harbor has become busier. More ships arrive. More goods pass through the city. Wealth increases. Population grows. The civilization becomes increasingly dependent upon its complex infrastructure. A small community can sometimes survive a disaster because it has fewer systems to fail. A large city can be more vulnerable because thousands of people depend upon interconnected services. Water must be delivered. Food must be stored. Roads must remain open. Buildings must remain stable. Trade must continue. Political authority must coordinate responses. When several systems fail simultaneously, the entire structure can become unstable. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, represents this vulnerability on a grand scale. The sea beyond the harbor is calm now, but the calmness itself is temporary. Storms are part of every maritime civilization. Ancient sailors watched clouds carefully because weather determined whether a voyage was safe. A clear morning could become dangerous by afternoon. Wind direction mattered. Wave height mattered. The shape of the coastline mattered. Sheltered bays could protect ships, while exposed shores could become dangerous. Communities living beside the sea learned these patterns through experience. A storm might be remembered for generations if it destroyed a harbor or caused many ships to disappear. Again, the sea became a source of stories. A single exceptional storm could become part of a larger cultural memory about the power of the ocean. If later combined with earthquake or flood traditions, it could contribute to a story about a civilization destroyed by water. Volcanic landscapes create another kind of memory. Unlike an earthquake, which may last only moments, volcanic activity can continue for days, weeks, or longer. There may be warning signs, eruptions, ashfall, strange smells, earthquakes, and changes in the landscape. Communities have time to fear what is happening, but may not understand how large the final event will become. The sky can change color. Ash can fall across fields. The sun can appear dim. Water sources may become contaminated. Animals may flee. Roads may become difficult to travel. A volcanic eruption can therefore feel like an entire environment becoming hostile. When the event ends, the landscape may be almost unrecognizable. Buildings can be buried. Fields can disappear. Shorelines can change. New rocks can cover old roads. Such a transformation naturally produces stories about worlds being destroyed. The island of Thera provides one of the clearest real examples of this kind of transformation in the ancient Mediterranean. The modern caldera landscape is itself evidence of enormous geological change. Standing on the cliffs today, it is possible to look across the water and imagine how difficult it would be to recognize the ancient island as it existed before the eruption. The sea occupies a space where volcanic land once stood. Layers of volcanic deposits preserve traces of the ancient environment. Beneath modern landscapes are remnants of earlier worlds. The physical island itself is a reminder that the land is not permanent. This does not turn Thera into Atlantis, but it gives the Atlantis idea a geological context that makes it easier to understand. Ancient people really did live on islands shaped by volcanic forces. Ancient settlements really were buried by eruptions. Coastal communities really did experience earthquakes and waves. The ingredients for a Lost Island story already existed in the real world. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that archaeology rarely produces a single dramatic moment of discovery. Instead, it gradually builds a picture from small pieces. A fragment of pottery tells us about manufacturing. A wall tells us about construction. A grain deposit tells us about agriculture. Animal bones tell us about diet. Tools tell us about technology. Soil layers reveal environmental changes. Charcoal can help establish dates. human remains can reveal health and migration. None of these pieces alone tells the entire story. Together, they can transform our understanding of a civilization. Atlantis, however, has become associated with the idea of a single enormous discovery that would suddenly explain everything. Real archaeology is usually much quieter. It involves years of excavation, comparison, dating, mapping, and interpretation. The truth often emerges gradually rather than dramatically. This is why the absence of convincing Atlantis remains matters. If an enormous civilization matching Plato's description had existed relatively recently in the locations commonly proposed, we would expect some physical evidence. Large settlements leave large traces. Roads, walls, pottery, tools, agricultural landscapes, burial sites, and trade materials can survive even when buildings disappear. A powerful maritime civilization would likely have interacted with neighboring cultures, leaving evidence beyond its own borders. Yet, no archaeological site has been found that matches the full description of Atlantis in a way accepted by mainstream scholarship. This does not mean that no unknown ancient settlement remains beneath the sea. It means that the specific civilization described by Plato has not been identified through archaeological evidence. The distinction between these two statements is important. There may still be discoveries waiting beneath the water, but we should not assume that every future discovery will be Atlantis. The underwater environment also presents enormous challenges for preservation. Saltwater can damage many materials, while sediment can bury others. Wood may survive only under particular conditions. Organic materials can disappear. Stone may remain, but become difficult to distinguish from natural rock. Metal can corrode. Structures can collapse under their own weight or be displaced by currents and geological movement. Even when ruins survive, their original arrangement may be difficult to reconstruct. A city that was once organized into streets and buildings can become a field of scattered stones. If the site lies in deep water, archaeological access becomes even more difficult. Modern underwater archaeology uses remotely operated vehicles, sonar mapping, submersibles, and other technologies. But the ocean remains challenging to explore. Darkness, pressure, currents, and distance all limit what can be examined directly. Imagine a remote archaeological survey moving slowly across the seabed. A sonar image reveals an unusual circular shape. The outline looks almost too regular to be natural. The survey team maps the feature from several directions. More details appear. There are ridges, depressions, and straight sections. At first glance, the shape seems architectural. But when the site is examined more closely, geological layers reveal a different explanation. The circular structure may be the edge of an ancient volcanic formation. The straight lines may be fractures in basalt. The apparent walls may be natural ridges shaped by erosion. This kind of discovery would still be scientifically valuable because it tells us about the geology of the ocean floor, but it would not be Atlantis. This is why extraordinary claims require careful evidence. The desire to find Atlantis can influence interpretation if researchers are not cautious. At the same time, skepticism should not become a reason to dismiss every unusual underwater discovery. The history of archaeology contains many examples of places that were poorly understood until new evidence changed interpretations. New technologies can reveal submerged landscapes that were previously invisible. Better dating methods can change chronologies. Geological research can explain environmental events that were once mysterious. Archaeology is a field in which conclusions can evolve as evidence accumulates. The responsible position is therefore neither blind belief nor automatic dismissal. It is curiosity combined with evidence. Atlantis can remain an interesting hypothesis about cultural memory, while the specific claims are evaluated according to archaeological and geological standards. As the imagined ocean grows darker again, the story begins to return to the quiet image with which we started: a lost city beneath the sea, stone walls covered in coral, roads buried beneath sand, water moving slowly through empty channels. Above the ruins, the waves continue their endless rhythm. The city has no need to speak. Its silence is part of the mystery. If the ruins are imaginary, they still represent the millions of ancient structures that have disappeared from human memory. If they are inspired by real places, they remind us that even major disasters can leave only fragments behind. And if some small part of the Atlantis tradition reflects an actual ancient event, perhaps the original story has become so transformed that recovering the exact source is no longer possible. Sometimes history survives not as a precise record, but as an echo. An echo is a useful way to think about Atlantis. Imagine a sound produced thousands of years ago in a distant valley. The original sound is gone almost immediately, but echoes bounce between mountains. Each reflection changes slightly. Some become weaker, others overlap. Eventually, someone far away hears only a faint fragment. They cannot identify the original source, but they know that something once made the sound. Cultural memory can work in a similar way. A disaster happens. People remember it. Their descendants retell it. The story travels across regions. Details merge. The original event becomes difficult to recognize, but the emotional core remains. There was once a place. Something happened. People suffered. The landscape changed. The memory survived. Atlantis could be such an echo, whether or not we can ever identify the original sound. The idea becomes even more compelling when we consider how humans respond to loss. A lost city is not simply a geographical problem. It is an emotional image. We are fascinated by abandoned places because they show us the passage of time. A ruined building allows us to imagine the people who once used it. A broken road suggests journeys that no longer happen. A deserted harbor makes us wonder about ships that once arrived there. An underwater city intensifies this feeling because the barrier of water creates physical distance between us and the past. We cannot simply walk through the ruins. We must imagine them. The water becomes both protection and separation. It preserves some evidence while keeping it hidden. Atlantis is therefore not only a story about civilization, it is a story about memory and absence. Perhaps this is why the mystery feels especially appropriate for a quiet night. During the day, the mind tends to focus on practical questions. Where is Atlantis? Was Plato telling the truth? Which island could match the description? What geological event could have caused the destruction? But at night, the mystery can be experienced differently. We can allow the questions to remain open. We can imagine the ancient coastline beneath the stars. We can hear the waves without needing to know what lies beneath them. We can picture the ruins slowly disappearing into darkness. The uncertainty itself becomes peaceful. There is no need to solve every mystery before falling asleep. Some mysteries are better left beneath the water. The moon rises above the imagined Atlantic once again, casting a pale reflection across the waves. The surface appears almost silver, but beneath it, the water becomes darker with every meter of depth. Somewhere far below, the ruins lie in silence. Perhaps there are circular walls. Perhaps there are natural rock formations mistaken for walls. Perhaps there are no ruins at all. The darkness does not tell us which possibility is true. It simply holds them all. The ocean has existed for hundreds of millions of years, while human civilization occupies only a tiny portion of that immense history. Cities rise and fall within moments compared with geological time. Empires become layers in the soil. Roads become sediment. Temples become foundations. Coastlines move. Islands change. The sea remains. And perhaps the final lesson of Atlantis is not about a lost civilization at all. Perhaps it is about the human tendency to believe that what surrounds us will always remain. We build cities and assume they will stand. We create traditions and assume they will be remembered. We draw borders and assume they will remain. We name mountains and rivers and assume the names will survive. Yet history repeatedly shows that everything changes. Sometimes the change is slow enough that generations barely notice it. Sometimes it is sudden enough to become legend. Atlantis represents the dramatic version of a universal truth. Nothing built by humans is completely permanent. The story asks us to imagine the greatest civilization we can, and then imagine it becoming quiet beneath the sea. The waves continue their slow movement across the surface. Beneath them, the imagined city rests in darkness. No lights remain. No voices remain. The roads are covered. The harbor is empty. The circular walls have become part of the seabed. Coral grows where buildings once stood. Sand moves through doorways that were designed to protect people from the outside world. The sea has entered every space. Time has removed the distinction between architecture and nature. Stone becomes rock again. Paths become sediment. Walls become reefs. The city is no longer a city in any practical sense. It has become a geological landscape containing traces of human activity, whether real or imagined. The darkness deepens one final time before dawn. The ocean becomes almost completely black beneath the surface, while the stars remain visible above the waves. The ancient world feels impossibly distant, yet the sea connects the present with the past. The same water that touches modern shores has been moving across the planet for countless generations. Ancient sailors watched waves that were formed by the same ocean system. Ancient settlements were built beside the same waters. Ancient people looked at the same moon. They did not know the future, just as we do not know ours. They built according to the world they understood. They told stories to explain what they could not understand. And one of those stories became Atlantis. Perhaps someday, a new archaeological discovery will change how we understand the legend. Perhaps a submerged settlement will reveal evidence of a previously unknown ancient community. Perhaps geological research will identify a disaster that helps explain an old tradition. Or perhaps no discovery will ever provide a physical Atlantis. The story may remain exactly where it has been for more than 2,000 years, suspended between history and imagination. That uncertainty does not diminish it. In fact, uncertainty may be the reason it survives. A mystery with a final answer eventually becomes a fact. A mystery without an answer remains alive. Each generation can return to it and ask the same questions again. So tonight, we can leave Atlantis beneath the waves. We do not need to raise its towers into the sunlight. We do not need to decide whether the city was real, fictional, or something between the two. We can simply watch the imagined ocean from above and allow the waves to move across the surface. Somewhere beneath the water are all the possibilities. A real ancient settlement, a transformed memory, a philosophical invention, a geological landscape, or perhaps nothing at all. The sea keeps them together without choosing between them. The wind moves gently across the water. The moon follows its slow path through the sky. The horizon remains dark and distant. And beneath that horizon, the mystery waits quietly, as it has waited for centuries, not asking to be solved tonight, but reminding us that the past is always larger than the pieces we manage to recover. The ocean slowly begins to brighten again, but beneath the surface, the imagined ruins remain wrapped in darkness. This transition from night toward morning feels appropriate for a story that has survived so many centuries, because Atlantis itself seems to exist between darkness and light, between something remembered and something forgotten, between history and imagination. When the first sunlight touches the waves, the sea gives no indication of what lies beneath. From the surface, everything appears ordinary. There's only the movement of water, the distant horizon, the changing color of the sky, and the soft sound of waves. Yet beneath that calm surface is an entire imagined world. And beneath the real oceans of our planet are countless genuine landscapes that no ancient storyteller could have known. The deeper we look into the mystery, the more we begin to understand that the fascination with Atlantis is really part of a much larger human fascination with hidden worlds. We have always wondered what lies beyond the mountain, beneath the desert, inside the cave, beyond the horizon, and beneath the sea. The unknown creates space for imagination, and Atlantis became one of the most enduring examples of what happens when that imagination is attached to an ancient story. The city does not have to be physically present for the mystery to remain powerful. Its greatest existence may be within the human mind, where every generation rebuilds the city differently, changes its appearance, moves its location, imagines its people, and gives new meaning to its disappearance. If we imagine the final days of a real ancient coastal civilization, the ending would probably have been much more complicated than the dramatic version found in popular stories. People would have made decisions. Some would have left early. Others would have remained because they believed the danger would pass. Families might have moved inland. Farmers might have abandoned fields. Traders might have taken their ships toward safer ports. Builders might have repaired damaged walls. Religious leaders might have interpreted the disaster through the beliefs of their time. Political leaders might have tried to maintain order. Children would have experienced the event differently from adults. Some people would have remembered the disaster clearly, while others would later remember only fragments. Years after the event, survivors could have told stories about the place they had lost. Their children would hear those stories without having experienced the original landscape themselves. Gradually, the lost settlement would become a symbol rather than a location. The emotional memory of home would become more important than the physical details. This is one of the ways real history can slowly become legend. The people who lived through a disaster know that it was complicated, but later generations prefer a simpler story. A city was there. Something terrible happened. The city was lost. The sea took it. The story becomes easier to remember, and eventually the details of the original event disappear beneath the larger image of loss. This process may help explain why so many lost city stories exist throughout human history. A city is more than buildings. It is a network of relationships, routines, memories, and places that give people a sense of belonging. When a city disappears, people lose more than physical structures. They lose streets they knew, homes they recognized, fields they cultivated, temples they visited, markets where they traded, and landscapes that shaped their identity. The memory of that place can become almost sacred. A lost homeland can become idealized. Its streets become cleaner in memory. Its people become wiser. Its buildings become larger. Its prosperity becomes greater. The actual difficulties of ordinary life disappear, leaving behind a perfect version of the past. Atlantis fits naturally into this pattern. It is described as powerful, organized, wealthy, and extraordinary, and its destruction makes the lost world even more attractive. A civilization that survives does not become a mystery. A civilization that disappears can become whatever later generations need it to be. There is also a quiet irony in the fact that Atlantis, was supposedly a civilization of enormous power. Yet, its most lasting achievement may be the story of its disappearance. The people of such a civilization, if they existed, would presumably have considered their buildings, political institutions, ships, agriculture, and military strength to be important. Yet, thousands of years later, none of those things can be verified as belonging to Atlantis. What survives is the idea of the city. This is true of many ancient civilizations in a different way. Sometimes the physical remains are extensive, but the people who built them are poorly understood. Sometimes the written records survive while the buildings disappear. Sometimes monuments survive while the original language is forgotten. History is selective. It preserves some things and destroys others. Atlantis represents the extreme case in which the physical civilization has become uncertain, while the story has become famous. The relationship between history and mythology therefore becomes impossible to ignore. Myth does not necessarily mean a story is meaningless or completely disconnected from reality. Myths can preserve cultural values, fears, memories, and explanations of the world. They can also be deliberately constructed stories designed to explore ideas. Plato's Atlantis can be approached in this way. Even if the island never existed as described, the story still reflects real concerns about politics, wealth, power, morality, geography, and natural disaster. It tells us how one ancient philosopher could imagine the rise and fall of a civilization. It also tells us something about the society in which he lived. The Athens of Plato's time had experienced political instability, military conflict, wealth, democratic experimentation, and war. The question of how a society should be organized was not abstract. It was deeply connected to the experiences of the Greek world. Atlantis allowed Plato to explore these questions through a distant civilization whose fate could serve as a warning. The ocean becomes the perfect setting for such a warning because it represents both connection and separation. It connects civilizations through trade and travel, but it also separates them geographically. It provides food and wealth, yet it can become dangerous. It allows people to explore distant places, but it also hides what lies beneath it. In the Atlantis story, the sea eventually becomes the boundary between the known world and the lost world. Once Atlantis disappears, the ocean prevents ordinary access to the place. This physical separation becomes symbolic separation. The city is not simply destroyed, it becomes unreachable. That is one reason the story remains so visually powerful. We can imagine the ruins, but we cannot simply walk among them. We have to descend into darkness to see them. And even then, we are entering a world of uncertainty. Modern technology has changed our ability to explore the ocean, but it has not eliminated the mystery. Sonar systems can map large sections of the seabed. Satellites can reveal broad geological patterns. Remotely operated vehicles can descend into depths that would be impossible for humans to reach safely. Submersibles can record images of deep-sea environments. Archaeologists can identify submerged structures, and study ancient coastlines. Yet, even with these tools, the ocean remains difficult to understand completely. The sheer size of the environment means that exploration is selective. We can map large regions, but mapping is not the same as understanding every feature. A sonar image can reveal a shape without immediately revealing its origin. Archaeological interpretation requires context. A structure must be dated, examined, compared, and understood within its environmental setting. The search for Atlantis, therefore, becomes a reminder that technology can reveal the hidden world without necessarily providing immediate answers. Perhaps one day explorers will discover another submerged ancient settlement that changes our understanding of prehistoric maritime cultures. Such a discovery would be fascinating, even if it had nothing to do with Atlantis. It could reveal how ancient people adapted to changing coastlines, how they built harbors, how they traded across seas, and how they responded to natural disasters. The discovery of a real lost settlement would remind us that the ancient world was larger and more complex than the surviving evidence suggests. But it would also be important to resist the temptation to attach the Atlantis name to every mysterious discovery. Archaeology becomes more meaningful when discoveries are allowed to tell their own stories rather than being forced into an existing legend. The imagined ruins remain quiet beneath the water as the sun climbs higher. Fish move between broken columns. Small marine organisms cover ancient-looking stones. Fine sediment settles across the seabed. Currents slowly reshape the landscape. This is perhaps what happens to every abandoned place eventually. Nature does not immediately erase architecture. Instead, it gradually changes its meaning. A wall becomes a surface for plants. A foundation becomes part of the terrain. A road becomes a channel for water. A building becomes a shelter for animals. Over enough time, the distinction between human construction and natural landscape becomes less obvious. The ocean accelerates this process in some ways because water continuously moves across the structures. Corals build their own skeletons over stone. Algae spreads across surfaces. Sand fills empty rooms. Currents transport small particles through doorways and corridors. Eventually, the city is no longer an empty human environment. It has become part of the marine ecosystem. This transformation offers another beautiful way to imagine Atlantis. Instead of seeing the ocean as simply hiding a dead civilization, we can imagine it creating a new living environment from the ruins. The old stone walls become reefs. Broken columns provide shelter for marine life. Sunken courtyards become habitats. Ancient canals become channels through which water flows. The civilization has not simply vanished. Its materials have been incorporated into another world. This is true on land as well. Abandoned buildings become habitats for birds, insects, plants, and animals. Human structures eventually become part of the landscape. Nature does not necessarily erase what humans build. Sometimes it absorbs it. The mystery of Atlantis, therefore, becomes less about destruction and more about transformation. A city can change into ruins. Ruins can become sediment. Sediment can become rock. Coastlines can become seabeds. Memories can become stories. Stories can become myths. Myths can become cultural symbols. Nothing remains exactly as it began, yet something continues through each transformation. This is perhaps the deepest reason the story feels so enduring. Atlantis itself has transformed many times. Plato's Atlantis was one thing. Medieval interpretations were another. Renaissance thinkers imagined it differently. Modern writers turned it into a lost continent or advanced civilization. Films and games transformed it again. Each generation has created a new Atlantis while believing it is searching for the old one. The physical island may remain uncertain, but the cultural Atlantis is very real. As the imagined day begins, the ocean becomes lighter and the stars disappear. The waves now reflect the pale morning sky. The ruins beneath the surface are almost impossible to see from above. That is perhaps how the mystery should end. Not with a dramatic discovery, but with the realization that some questions become meaningful precisely because they cannot be completely answered. We can investigate Plato's writings. We can study geology. We can examine archaeological evidence. We can explore submerged landscapes. We can compare ancient traditions. We can identify real disasters that may have influenced later stories. But after all of that, there may still be uncertainty. And uncertainty is not failure. It is part of historical knowledge. The past is not a complete recording waiting to be played back. It is a collection of surviving fragments from which we construct the most reasonable explanations possible. The imagined Atlantis now becomes almost invisible. Only a few faint outlines remain beneath the blue water, and even those begin to disappear as sunlight changes the surface. The circular walls that once seemed enormous become tiny shadows. The harbor becomes a pattern on the seabed. The roads become lines beneath sand. The mountains beyond the city become indistinguishable from natural geological formations. The sea has erased the distinction between the real and the imagined. There is no sign above the water that anything unusual ever existed below. A sailor passing over the location would see only waves. Birds would cross the sky. Clouds would move across the horizon. The world would continue as if the city had never been there. And perhaps that is the final image worth carrying into sleep. An empty ocean above an unknown world. Not necessarily Atlantis, not necessarily ruins, but the enormous hidden history beneath the waves. The ocean floor contains landscapes that have changed over geological time, sediments that record ancient climates, volcanic rocks created by forces deep inside the earth, and traces of human activity that occasionally survive beneath the water. The sea is not empty. It is a vast archive, but an archive written in forms that require patience to read. Some pages have been destroyed. Others are buried. Some are written in stone. Some survive only as fragments. And somewhere within that enormous archive is the possibility that ancient stories contain echoes of real places, even when the original details have disappeared. The waves continue their gentle rhythm. The sun is now above the horizon, but beneath the water, the imagined city remains in perpetual twilight. Its streets are empty. Its buildings are silent. Its canals no longer carry ships. Its fields no longer produce crops. Its walls no longer protect anyone. Yet the idea of the city continues to travel. It has moved from an ancient philosophical dialogue into thousands of years of human thought. It has become a question asked by historians, archaeologists, geologists, writers, explorers, and dreamers. Some seek proof. Others enjoy the mystery. Some believe there must be a real place behind the story. Others see Atlantis as a powerful fictional construction. The truth may never satisfy everyone because the story itself has become larger than its origins. So as the journey finally begins to fade into the quiet sound of the ocean, there is no need to choose between belief and disbelief. We can simply acknowledge what is known and allow the unknown to remain unknown. Plato wrote about Atlantis. Ancient societies experienced earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, storms, and changing coastlines. Real settlements have disappeared. Real landscapes have been submerged. Real memories have become legends. Modern geology does not support the idea of a lost continent suddenly sinking beneath the Atlantic. And archaeology has not identified a civilization that matches Plato's Atlantis. But none of these facts makes the story less beautiful. Instead, they place it within the much larger and more fascinating story of humanity's relationship with the sea, the earth, memory, and time. The ocean is calm now. The imagined ruins rest beneath the waves. The wind moves gently across the surface, creating long lines of silver and blue. Far below, the last traces of the city disappear into the darkness. Whether they were ever real does not need to be decided tonight. The story has already done what stories have always done. It has carried us somewhere beyond the ordinary world and allowed us to imagine another time. Now, the journey can become quieter. The questions can soften. The ancient walls can fade. The waves can become the only sound that remains. Atlantis does not need to rise again. It can stay beneath the sea, where mystery and memory have rested together for more than 2,000 years. While above it, the ocean continues its endless movement beneath the changing sky. The morning light continues to spread across the ocean, turning the dark surface into shades of pale blue and silver, while beneath the waves, the imagined ruins remain untouched by the changing sky. The city that once seemed so enormous has become almost impossible to distinguish from the natural landscape around it. Stone walls are softened by coral. Stairways are covered by sand, and the outlines of ancient buildings have become quiet shapes on the seabed. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining a place that no longer needs to function. No roads need repair. No ships need to arrive. No fields need to produce food, and no walls need to be defended. The the city has finally escaped the demands that once made it powerful. Time has reduced everything to silence. Whether Atlantis was ever a real place is now less important than the image itself. An ancient world beneath a calm sea, separated from the present by water and thousands of years. Above the ruins, modern oceans continue to move according to the same basic forces that shaped the ancient world. Winds cross the surface, currents carry water across enormous distances, waves approach distant shores, and the moon continues to influence the tides. The ocean does not remember the names of the people who once lived beside it. It does not remember kings, armies, temples, merchants, farmers, or philosophers. It simply continues moving. In that sense, the sea becomes a perfect symbol for time itself. Human lives pass quickly. Civilizations rise and fall, stories change. But the larger natural world continues beyond any individual generation. Perhaps the most valuable lesson hidden inside the Atlantis mystery is the importance of humility when looking at the past. We naturally want ancient history to provide clear answers, but the surviving evidence is incomplete. Entire languages have disappeared. Libraries have been destroyed. Wooden structures have decayed. Coastal settlements have been submerged. Earthquakes have rearranged landscapes. Wars have destroyed archives. Later civilizations have built directly over earlier ones. What survives is only a fraction of what once existed. This means that history is partly an exercise in reconstruction. We gather fragments and try to understand the larger picture without pretending that every missing piece can be recovered. Atlantis teaches this lesson beautifully because the story itself may be a mixture of known realities and imaginative construction. We can identify the historical world in which Plato lived. We can study the geological disasters experienced by ancient Mediterranean societies. We can examine Bronze Age settlements and volcanic eruptions. We can investigate submerged landscapes and changing coastlines. Yet, after all these investigations, a space remains where certainty ends. That space does not have to be filled with speculation. It can simply remain open. Sometimes, the most honest historical conclusion is that we do not know. And so, as the imagined journey comes to its final quiet moments, the city beneath the sea begins to disappear completely. The circular waterways become shadows. The monumental buildings become indistinct shapes. The harbor becomes nothing more than a faint pattern beneath the sediment. The surrounding mountains fade into the blue darkness. Soon, there is no visible city at all, only the seabed and the slow movement of water. If Atlantis was a real place, this is perhaps how its physical remains might look after immense periods of time. Fragmented, altered, buried, and transformed by natural processes. If it was never a real place, then the disappearance is equally appropriate, because the city exists most strongly as an idea. In both cases, the mystery survives. The surface remains calm. The waves continue. The horizon stretches endlessly ahead. There is no final monument rising from the water to provide an easy answer. and perhaps there never should be. Atlantis has endured precisely because it remains just beyond certainty, a story balanced between history and imagination, between the evidence we possess and the worlds we can still imagine beneath the sea. Now let the sound of the waves become softer in your mind. Imagine the ocean stretching toward the horizon beneath a quiet sky, with no ships nearby and no lights visible on distant shores. Somewhere far below, perhaps there are real ancient stones resting beneath layers of sediment, perhaps remnants of settlements whose names have been forgotten, perhaps geological formations that have existed for millions of years, or perhaps only the natural contours of the ocean floor. We do not need to know which. The mystery can remain where it belongs. The ancient world has already given us enough to wonder about. Cities that have been excavated, ships that have been found, settlements preserved beneath volcanic ash, coastlines that disappeared beneath rising seas, and civilizations whose achievements survived long after their names were forgotten. Atlantis gathers all of these ideas into one unforgettable image, a place that was once alive, then became lost, then became a story, and finally became a question asked across generations. The ocean continues its endless rhythm as the journey comes to an end. The waves rise gently and fall again. Wind moves across the surface. Morning becomes day. Day will eventually become evening, and evening will return to night. Somewhere beneath that cycle of light and darkness, the imagined city remains still. No one needs to enter its silent streets. No one needs to discover its final secret. It can remain beneath the water, protected by distance, time, and uncertainty. The mystery of Atlantis does not belong entirely to the ancient world anymore. It belongs to everyone who has ever looked across the sea and wondered what might exist beyond the horizon. It belongs to anyone who has walked among ruins and imagined the people who once stood there. It belongs to anyone who has wondered how much of human history has disappeared without leaving a clear record. And perhaps, in the quietest sense, it belongs to the ocean itself, because the ocean is where so many stories eventually become silence. Tonight, we have traveled through that silence, not to prove that Atlantis existed, but to understand why the idea has survived. Now, the journey can rest. The ancient walls can fade into darkness. The sea can become the only image left. The waves can continue moving slowly beneath the sky, carrying the mystery forward without ever revealing exactly what lies below. And somewhere beneath those waves, in the vast space between memory and history, Atlantis can remain exactly what it has always been, a lost world waiting not necessarily to be found, but simply to be imagined.